So good morning, everyone. So glad for everyone to be here this morning on day 2 of Cyburgh. I'm Audrey Russo, President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Technology Council. We had a great day yesterday. We hoped that those of you who were with us yesterday really enjoyed the keynote and the panel discussion. It was like many things in this topic, very not enough time to cover a lot of ground. And I imagine that's going to be the same thing this morning. We have a packed morning. We're going to kick it off with our technical keynote, and then it's going to be followed by 2 panel discussions, 2 optional keynotes, which will then take us into our daily business as usual program at noon. So we are packed way until 12:30. So hopefully you have coffee and some snacks with you, and we'll enjoy your time hanging out with all these amazing people today and listening to them. So before we get started with our technical keynote, I want to thank our sponsors because we can't do anything without them. But before our sponsors, I want to give a shout out to Monica Takis. If you don't know her, you really should. She is key on our team, and she oversees this series and all the content and all the delivery. And she works really hard to try to make sure that everything goes off without a hitch, but also making sure that the topics that we cover today are absolutely timely and that we get the best people to speak. And today is no exception. So thanks to the sponsors, Ethical Intruder, David Kane and his team. I'll introduce him in a minute. They've been long partners of ours for at least the 11 years that he has been in business and started Ethical Intruder. Keynote sponsor, thank you so much, going to Recorded Future. Panel sponsors, Expedient, Gray Matter, and Schneider Downs, and the breakout sponsors, All Lines Tech, Databank, iBoss, and Ideal Integrations. Community sponsor goes to Dollar Bank, and supporting sponsors, Advanticom, Fortinet, Okta, and Quintel. So I want to thank all of them. My apologies for stumbling on a couple of words. I'm just drinking my first cup of coffee, but that doesn't mean that I don't deeply appreciate all the support that you have provided for us to make this happen. So at this time, please welcome David Kane. He's a dear friend to the tech community, to the Tech Council, and he is the CEO of Ethical Intruder, who will then present Adopting to the Changing Security Landscape, Key Trends and Shifts for the New Normal. That couldn't be a better title. I would say that we're changing each and every day. So my hat's off to all of the people who will be speaking today. Thank you so much. I will be here being quiet because now I'm going to pass the baton to David Kane, and we are going to start the program.
Great. Thank you, Audrey. Glad to be here. Welcome to day 2 of Cyburgh. Day 1 was great. Some really good keynotes and sessions and breakouts. So we are always excited to be a part of this event. It is a community event, so it's also great to be able to reach out and see people at least this year. And of course, we're all excited next year that we'll be able to, hopefully even sooner than next year, but at least for this event, see each other in person. As Audrey mentioned, my name is David Kane. I'm the CEO and the founder of Ethical Intruder. And yes, we have, as you mentioned, a longtime supporters of the Tech Council, and really excited to be the presenting sponsor this year. 2 quick housekeeping notes before we get started. One is just in support of all of the vendors out there. There are vendor cards that you should have access to, where you could visit and get some information and takeaways and giveaways from the vendors. So please do visit those cards, learn more about the vendors that are here, register for some event freebies, and maybe a chance to win something as well. Second housekeeping note is a little bit more serious, but I thought it was important, again, as this is a community event. I wanted to make sure those listening knew that, if you were not already aware, that late yesterday, VMware released a critical patch now update related to remote code execution vulnerability. To pull off this attack, all you need is access to port 443 and somebody who does not have an update on VMware vSphere. This affects all customers. It is a score of 9.8 out of 10. And so I'm actually going to take, and yes, I am a cybersecurity person giving you something potentially to click on, but I'm actually going to share here in a little bit the actual information from VMware, but it's something that you may want to take a moment and pass back to your company or start looking at, because again, this affects all people with VMware vSphere. So moving on from that, as Audrey mentioned, my topic today is adapting to the changing security landscape, key trends and shifts for the new normal. So first of all, I've been really excited that we have not discussed very much the pandemic over this last day. And of course, I have a title that goes right to the heart of the new normal and the pandemic. And so I'm going to defeat my own wish not to sort of do that. But I think it's really important because there have been a lot of changes over the last 16 months. And I think, reflecting on the successes that we've all done in several events, and looking forward maybe at how the landscape has shifted, I think is very important. So we're going to look at just a couple of different topics, and then if we have time, I have a few other areas that are just good cyber hygiene areas that I think, as we work with companies throughout the Pittsburgh region, we continue to see a need to have additional focus on some of the things that I wish I had a better word for this, but maybe aren't quite as sexy or fun or exciting maybe to focus on, but they're still critical areas to focus on. So the first area that has really emerged pretty heavily over the last 16 months, and it was already sort of on its way, relates to DevSecOps or secure SDLC. And there's a lot of buzz around what DevSecOps is and secure SDLC and regular DevOps and all of the differences. But it's something that's really important. And then we're going to go and talk to a little bit about incident response. And again, what we've seen is a pretty good surge in actually doing tabletop exercises. Most compliances have a requirement somewhere to have a incident response policy, to actually have a program where you're training individuals, and to actually do the exercise. What we have seen over the years is that a lot of companies maybe fall a little bit short on the tabletop exercises, and through the pandemic and being prepared for the totally unexpected, I think we've all learned that maybe these exercises are more important. And the third topic, key topic that I want to talk about, is the influx of collaborative tools. And not only just the influx on those tools, but the effect as security leaders and business leaders that has had on data classification, data governance, and even some vendor management practices, all of which are very important. So to start with, as we all know, everybody transitioned, all of us, to work from home in 2021. You may have noticed, as most people have, if you're in leadership, a surge of questionnaires that have come from partners and customers, and also have come from cyber liability insurance carriers. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. The reason why is that, again, over the last 16 months, we've really seen a tremendous increase in the change to the security landscape of what we traditionally used to just consider our network boundaries. Our core infrastructure, how we handle remote users and cloud assets, obviously have had a dramatic change. The thing that most people have done, or the items that most people have conquered already, is adding VPNs and multi-factor, right? I mean, this was something that almost everybody did successfully as soon as the pandemic started. And since the pandemic, not only have you probably added VPNs and multi-factor, or at least the amount that you probably have had somebody approach you about investing in zero trust. If you haven't, you're really good at avoiding some of the vendors out there. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more today. So DevSecOps, many companies, most companies have some type of either web application or a customer portal, or a mobile application, or potentially an IoT device. And any of those that have any of those pieces, you definitely should be familiar with to some degree DevOps, DevSecOps, and secure SDLC. This is a topic that should become very important for CISOs, and again, for anybody in security and IT leadership. A CISO, based off of their background, is probably never going to review code or get too deep into the software development process or the deployment process. Typically, their involvement is more around assigning individuals on their team to focus on code review or a pen test. But those people who are building web applications, mobile applications, portal IoT devices, you know, to tie it into a recent event, and this is maybe where it might be helpful to see how these intersect, DevSecOps is the type of things that could prevent another SolarWinds type of attack. SolarWinds was a supply chain attack. It happened where, as most of us know, somebody got into the update process of a partner's software where there was most likely a lack of integrity checking to assure that the software update was what it was supposed to be. The signature was then signed by SolarWinds as being something that you can have, and then it was passed out in a patch or an update as something that's official. So the important piece here is to understand how you build security into your development process. And again, I'm not talking about what people are already doing today, which is code review and penetration testing. What we're really talking about is moving security left in the development cycle. So that's something that is another big term, is to shift left. We like to say maybe to even start left at ethical intruder. But DevSecOps for a CISO or for a leader is more about assuring that you have a better understanding early on in the development phases, not just after it's happening, how you're actually reviewing security. So we all know that web app security has been around for a while. It's not necessarily new. And again, I'll move on to some other topics here in just a moment. As a matter of fact, ethical intruder, when we started 11 years ago, most of us came out of a product engineering, software engineering space and realized that there wasn't a lot of good testing for applications. But even then, we didn't really think about necessarily building it in from the beginning. But what happened after the pandemic was that software teams, like a lot of teams, but especially software teams, tend to work collectively together, collaboratively on premises. And so when the pandemic happened, there was a big move to find collaborative cloud strategies to continue software development, IoT development, different types of engineering. DevSecOps and working in the cloud was already there, and it just made sense that if you were going to move in that direction, you may as well follow best practices. And so because the sort of decentralized way of working together has caused some issues of how development's going to work, that actually has created a pretty tremendous increase in DevSecOps and secure SDLC. So again, this is really about, if you're a leader, just understanding more about how you build it in earlier on and being able to detect where issues might be versus simply what a lot of people are doing today, which is code review and pen testing, which we do a lot of pen testing. So it's, we like that. We're not telling you not to do that, but definitely worth looking at DevSecOps. And our director of cybersecurity, Jake Wiley, will actually be having a breakout session on this topic, I believe, tomorrow. There was actually an interesting article that came out yesterday that I think said it very well, that there's just a lack of cohesion between software development and cybersecurity functions within an organization, and that compounds the software supply chain risk focused by organizations. The same article, which I think I just found at CSO Online and was written by CSO Online, 56% of people that are actually in the software space at companies feel like they don't have the education or the tools to protect against a SolarWinds style attack. So it's not just how do we protect against SolarWinds within our network. You can't protect against it as well if the code is signed unless you start to work on that much earlier on. So again, we'll move on from there, but if you have not spent some time, definitely spend some time investigating what that is. Another area where we've seen a very large increase, which rightfully so, over the last year, is the increase in the incident response tabletop exercise. So for those of you who are not familiar or who haven't been part of one, this is basically a fire drill that you do with your team to build that muscle memory of the core things that you want to do in every type of incident. And so let me take a step back and talk about what I just mentioned. This is not about necessarily specific playbooks that you have for a specific type of attack. This is about knowing those core elements that you want to follow during any type of incident the same way every single time, because this is what matters to protect your organization from reputation and financial harm. So the ability to, make sure we know who the leader is, make sure that we can assign teams effectively. We hear from customers all the time, we had an incident and the problem was that the communication and the coordination was just off. How to set up, the criticality of what the issues are, how to set up the daily communications, how to understand how to notify internally and externally if there actually is an event. And that includes customers, insurers, the police. So going through these tabletop exercises are super important. And we have seen a tremendous increase in requests about that. So something that we definitely think is important. For those of you considering looking into this and preparing again for the unknown, one of the key considerations that we often suggest is to split out your tabletops so that you have a technical component and you have a leadership component. And here's the reason why. Almost all companies here today have some type of cyber liability insurance. If you don't, you should probably have it. Cyber liability insurance has very specific requirements built into it about how you can report an incident and how they want you to react to an incident. So the information from your cyber liability insurance policy needs to be reflected actually in your incident response policy, and then reflected in your training, and then reflected in your tabletop, so that when you're going through a scenario, you understand who's actually supposed to call an insurer, what types of things you can mention. And one of the things that many cyber liability insurance policies have is that there is an order of who you can tell and when you can tell the public, when you can tell customers, what employees can say. If you do not follow these specifics within your cyber liability insurance policy, it is possible that you won't get covered. And some of you may have actually seen, I think it was France or it was one of the EU countries actually just announced recently that they are going to stop covering with cyber liability insurance ransomware. So it's really important to understand and build a program around what your obligations are to your company when they've actually paid for that insurance. So when you bring in a leadership team, my point being that it's good to understand how compliance and legal and financial and how the leader of the incident response is actually going to interact with the leadership team. And the third parties that you might have, you might work with SecureWorks, or you might work with an ethical intruder or somebody who actually helps out with incident response. And so running through all of those pieces with leadership is really important. And again, this is something that it's not a selling point. Again, anybody that has a compliance for PCI, NIST, CMMC, HIPAA, this requirement is baked in. SOC, ISO is actually baked in. And with the Colonial Pipeline attack, one of the things that happened was that there has been an increase in questionnaires. There has been an increase in discussions around compliance and new regulations. And most likely, those regulations will start to even more reinforce how you react to one of these types of issues. And a final note about that, and then we'll move on to the third topic, is that if you haven't noticed this yet, you might notice in the future that cyber liability insurers are now actually making very specific requests of their customers in order to renew their insurance. I think Mark Vescovi from Liberty Tire mentioned this yesterday, but it's very important to understand that if there's things that you know that you should be doing related to a response and protecting yourself, you actually could potentially not be able to get cyber insurance moving forward. The other thing that's starting to happen, which I don't think is 100% ethical, but a lot of cyber insurance companies are actually starting to scan your networks and basically come and tell you what your vulnerabilities are. And if they find vulnerabilities that they don't like, you have to fix them immediately. Or again, you may not be covered for insurance. So for those of you in leadership, the point I'm really trying to bring to attention is that an incident is the ultimate thing that affects our financial or reputational position as a company. That's the main thing that we're trying to protect against. Prior to the pandemic, when we would build business continuity plans, people would want to skip the pandemic part because we're never going to have a global pandemic. And so again, due to your requirements for cyber liability insurance and due to your requirements for compliance, we highly suggest that you look into this, which again, this spike is absolutely a direct correlation to the events of the pandemic. So the third area I want to talk about is collaborative tools. And I'm using a fairly loose description of collaborative tools, but if we were in person and I were to ask how many people here have increased since February 2020, considerably increased the use of items like Zoom, which we're all using. But in this particular case, I want to talk about Teams or Slack. I have a feeling that almost all the hands would go up. And so the fact is that's great, right? Again, same thing we talked about with DevOps. You have to find ways to work together, and that's great. The issue with it is that it does affect a really good position that we used to have for data classification and for data governance. And what I mean by that is that anybody who is regulated or follows, again, ISO or SOC or any of these pieces, when the auditors come around, they want to know where is your restricted data. They want to know how are you monitoring your restricted data. All of the compliances want to know, and all of the frameworks, whether you're regulated or not, want to know how are you monitoring any DLP related issues for data loss prevention for this issues. This is going to be a huge concern coming up, and I think it just hasn't quite hit yet. I think that this is a laggard right now, but I think as audits start to pick up over the next year, I think we're going to start to see this a lot. The issue is that we've gone from having really good data governance and data classification rules about where people can store their data and how we protect that data, to having data in Slack channels, to having data in Teams. We've seen companies where people are exfiltrating large amount of data out of Teams, and they're not aware of it. And so again, there's a conflict there with data classification and all the rules that you have. Now, there are ways to handle this, and one of the best ways to handle it, and those of you who know Ethical Intruder, we are 100% vendor and technology agnostic. There's very few technologies or vendors that we will strongly recommend. But for a very large majority of you that already have Office 365, you probably have a lot of controls that you are already paying for. And let me stress that again, you are already paying for these tools with your Office 365 licenses that you have that will help you with GDPR and privacy and pooling information. It'll help you with data loss prevention. It'll help you with data retention and making sure that people are not storing certain type of documents. So while I want to highlight that this is probably an increasing area that we all have to consider, which is the type of sensitive data that we used to in many organizations make sure we're restricted by data classifications for certain areas. that there are things out there that you can do, but moving forward, as we're sort of coming out of the fog of COVID, I think it's important for us to start focusing again on what are we allowing people to store in collaborative tools, share in collaborative tools. Do we have a way to actually monitor it? And do we have a way to actually know if the data is moving? So I think that's very important. A couple other quick things, and then I think there may have been a couple of questions, so I'll look real fast. And maybe I can just go into the
Audrey, can you answer the question? Do you see it? You want me to read it?
Sure, you can read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, this is from Zen Piotrowski, and saying, surprised that some financial institutions are creating funds that include Bitcoin. This gives legitimacy to a payment method that by its nature is dubious in terms that it can't be traced. So you have any comments or thoughts on that?
That's a tough one. I mean, unfortunately, digital currency, I don't even know if it's unfortunately is sort of the wave of the future. I don't know that we're actually going to be able to stop that. One of the things that they have added is that you actually now can make a, I forget what the right term is, but you can basically complain about a wallet. I think it's called wallet abuse. So if somebody does ask for something in Bitcoin, you can report the wallet that it's being requested to go to. Unfortunately, because it's a very open source environment, I think a lot of people really want to make sure that they don't focus too much on stopping the electronic coins. And I think there were two different questions about the pipeline, it looks like. Let's see, the second one was Colonial Pipeline is clearly a regulatory issue. Security wasn't baked in. It was a bolt-on approach, really very little regulation on OT. And maybe that's more of a comment, is mostly foreign owned. So correct. So, the Colonial Pipeline, I mean, we have a minute left, but there's a lot that goes on there. It is related to OT. I think we're gonna have a conversation coming up about that in just a minute. So great timing. But I think there are lessons learned. I think somebody asked the question yesterday, which industries are left that have to still get hit by the big one until that industry actually catches on to the things that they need to do. And I guess the last piece that I was gonna cover, so I'll try to do it in just a minute, is that from our perspective, there are a lot of things that you can do to sort of protect yourself, but always look back first at what you already have. The CIS controls are a really great way to do this. They have the top 20 controls. They break them down into 3 different categories, including implementation groups. And if you follow and make sure that you apply the implementation group 1 controls for CIS, I think it blocks something like 62% of all of the MITRE attack framework attacks that can happen with your company. So it's very powerful, I think, to go back and look at some of the basics. And it's always great to look at new tools and moving forward, but I think it's also really important to look at your core cyber hygiene and make sure that you have everything in place. So I think that's it. It is coming up on 9:30, so I'll pass it back over to you or Monica. So Audrey, you're on mute.
It's giving me major commands. Okay, there's still questions, but
sure.
We don't have time, so we'll save it. So we'll save the question and get it to you, and then share it with everyone else. So that was great. Thank you. Lots to pack in. And actually, while I was listening to you, I texted my guy on the finance side and said, "Can we look at that security policy again, please?" So really appreciate all that you've done. So there's lots of comments, and we'll save them. So thanks, David. Thanks for taking the time. You're getting nice comments in the chat as well. So